Well, 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 would you look at the time? Looks to me it's bad games o'clock once again. Although the rest of the world was going to plops in 2016, it was at the very least not the worst time to be a gamer, with the likes of Uncharted 4, Inside, and Overwatch garnering pretty decent review scores upon release. You're not here to listen to us harp on about the good stuff though, and so we're back yet again to tell you about all of the most egregious games that released in the year 2016. If it's your first time here, welcome! Allow me to acquaint you with the rules. We love rules. In order to earn a spot on our worst games of X year lists, a game must have received a minimum of 7 professional reviews and a release in at least one territory in the year in question. We get our review scores from both Metacritic and Game Rankings, and when the two sites have differing opinions, we go with whichever one is lowest. With all of that nice and clear, I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst games of 2016. Number 10. Umbrella Corps, PC, 36%. The Resident Evil series has gone through its ups and downs over the years. The likes of Resident Evil and Resident Evil 4 released to more or less universal critical acclaim, whereas Resident Evil 5 and 6 got a fairly lukewarm response from both players and reviewers. It wasn't until 2016 that the franchise hit an all-time low though, when Capcom released Umbrella Corps, a tactical shooter set in the Resident Evil universe. The story was basically non-existent, and players were simply plonked into familiar settings and tasked with dispatching enemy forces and, of course, zombies. The idea behind the game wasn't the worst that anyone's ever had, but Umbrella Corps was severely lacking in several key areas. It was absolutely riddled with bugs, the controls were sloppy, and the online matchmaking barely functioned, which in a game that relied so heavily on multiplayer was a big no-no. In fairness, that was partly to do with the fact that no one was playing it, but even when they were, things fared no better. On the plus side, Umbrella Corps did serve to punctuate an era of subpar Resident Evil games as the outstanding Resident Evil 7 Biohazard released in 2017, much to the relief of longtime fans. Number 9. Alekine's Gun, PlayStation 4, 35%. Of all of the video game genres that are out there, it's fairly safe to say that stealth is probably one of the hardest to nail. There can't be too much action, because if that's the case, then it's not really stealth, but the game also can't be too slow-paced. You've also got to nail your stealth mechanics, otherwise you're going to upset your players when the brick wall they're hiding behind turns out to be invisible to enemies. Clearly the team behind Alekine's Gun didn't get a copy of my book, How to Make a Good Stealth Game, because they totally flubbed it! The game is set at the height of the Cold War, with players taking on the role of Agent Alekine, a Russian assassin that ends up working alongside the CIA. On paper, the premise sounds alright, but a bungled execution, no pun intended, left Alekine's Gun with some seriously poor review scores. Critics blasted the game for everything from its horrible graphics and frame rate to its clunky controls and dumb AI. It also lacked an autosave feature, which for a game in 2016 was unforgivable, didn't allow players to skip cutscenes, and overall just wasn't very fun to play. Number 8. Coffin Dodgers, PlayStation 4, 35%. Over the years, we've seen a ton of developers attempting to put their own spin on the kart racer genre, with mixed results. The likes of Mario Kart and Crash Team Racing have delighted players the world over, whereas titles such as Garfield Kart have done nothing but disappoint. Coffin Dodgers falls into the latter category. Coffin Dodgers sees players racing OAPs in order to avoid the Grim Reaper, and if that sounds a bit dark to you, it is, that's why. The winners live to die another day, whereas the losers kick the bucket and come back in later races as zombified versions of themselves. Sadly, the premise was about the only interesting thing that Coffin Dodgers had to offer, because as kart races go, it was pretty rubbish. There were 8 different races to choose from, but none of them had different stats, so the choice was purely aesthetic. Once on the courses, the races were hugely challenging, though this was less to do with any sort of skill requirement and more to do with the oversensitive controls and dodgy camera. Throw into the mix some bland graphics, an irritating soundtrack, and unfriendly UI, and you end up with a game that, well, let's just say we wouldn't think twice before shutting off its live support. Number 7. 7 Days to Die, Xbox One, 35%. Here at TripleJump, it really pains us when a decent game gets a shoddy port. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened to 7 Days to Die, which originally entered early access on PC in 2013. The game plops players into a sandbox world and tasks them with surviving the zombie apocalypse. The idea is to scavenge, craft, and hunt for anything you need, all whilst fending off the elements, wild animals, and hordes of the undead. The vast majority of players enjoyed the PC release, and even though it's still in early access at the time of writing, it's a solid survival experience. The console releases, on the other hand, were a travesty. There were three main problems with 7 Days to Die's ports. Firstly, no changes had been made to the UI, so players found it difficult to navigate the game with a controller. Secondly, the graphics had been significantly downgraded, leaving players with a subpar visual experience. And last but not least, like the PC release, the console version of 7 Days to Die was clearly unfinished, which was unacceptable for a full-priced game. If optimized for consoles, 7 Days to Die could have been a slam dunk, but the rubbish port left players sorely disappointed. Number 6. Langrissa Reincarnation, Tensei, 3DS, 35%. Throughout the 1990s, the Langrissa series earned itself a number of fans with its rich Germanic-inspired lore, blend of RPG and tactical warfare elements, and unique art style. The franchise languished a bit through the 2000s though, and so when Langrissa Reincarnation Tensei was announced for the Nintendo 3DS, fans were excited for a revival. Unfortunately, what they got was more of a Weekend at Bernie's situation, and all they could do was look on, horrified, as the corpse of the franchise was paraded before their very eyes. Players take on the role of Ares Lavina, a young man who happens to come across the legendary Langrissa sword whilst his town is under attack from the Imperial Army. By using the powerful blade, he is able to fend off the army and sets off on a journey to bring an end to the war. On a technical level, Langrissa Reincarnation wasn't bad, but as we all know, just because you're not full of bugs, it doesn't mean you're a good game. The visual presentation of the title was ugly, the story was derivative, and the gameplay was lackluster. Considering what series like Fire Emblem were achieving at the time, there was just no reason for players to pick up Langrissa Reincarnation. Number 5. Crystal Rift, PlayStation 4, 32.86%. In theory, Crystal Rift sounds great. A dungeon crawler in VR? You might be thinking to yourself, where do I sign up? Not so fast, young grasshopper, for not only was Crystal Rift incredibly disappointing, but it also induced nausea in several critics. Inspired by old-school dungeon crawlers such as Dungeon Master and Eye of the Beholder, Crystal Rift sees players controlling an adventurer as they make their way through a series of interconnected rooms littered with foes and traps. Allegedly, the game could be played either in VR or with a traditional controller, though players who opted for the latter discovered that by doing so, Crystal Rift was darn near unplayable thanks to the fixed camera angle that meant that they couldn't even see the floor in front of them. The VR fared slightly better, but not by much, as critics found that the juddery movement made them feel quite sick. If you were to look beyond the control problems, you wouldn't find much more to love, as the copy-paste dungeons and enemies made the whole thing an exercise in tedium. Some critics did praise the game's puzzles, but as they were peppered into an otherwise dull title, they weren't enough to transform Crystal Rift into a decent experience. Number 4. Weeping Doll, PlayStation 4, 32%. We're sticking with VR for the time being as we turn our attention to Weeping Doll, an interactive horror story from developer Tianxia Media. Weeping Doll puts players into the shoes of a maid working in a Japanese mansion and tasks them with uncovering their employer's dark past. It could have been an interesting concept, but the game was A. incredibly short, allowing no time for any meaningful story to develop, and B. horrendously anticlimactic, with one reviewer noting that the ending was so poorly done that it wasn't until the PSN trophy popped that he realised the game was over. To its credit, what little Weeping Doll had to offer wasn't totally bungled. The puzzles were okay, but there weren't enough of them, the story was well told but ended abruptly, and the game was, in places, quite atmospheric. Rather than feeling like a completed game, Weeping Doll seemed more like a proof of concept. Had there been more for critics to sink their teeth into, and had the ending not been rushed, the game might have fared better than it did. In the end, though, there was just too little on offer to allow anyone to recommend it. Weeping Doll? More like, Jesus wept. Got him. Number 3. Dino Dini's Kickoff Revival, PlayStation 4, 31%. Oh yeah, here we go, sports time! I've played a football game before, but I've never played a dinosaur-themed football game, so I'm going to give this everything I've got. What do you mean Dino Dini isn't about a dinosaur? Well, there's no wonder his game didn't get a very good review score, as they're bloody misleading. Indeed, Dino Dini, or Dino Dini, if you want to pronounce it different, if you want to get different about this, is not a prehistoric reptile, but is in fact a man who develops video games, and in the past he's developed some alright ones. He must have been having an off year in 2016 though, as Dino Dini's Kickoff Revival ended up being more like Dino Dini's Dead on Arrival. That's a good one, got him. In terms of its premise, Kickoff Revival is a similar concept to the likes of the FIFA and PES series. You control a team of footballers and the aim of the game is to score as many goals as possible. Critics did not pull any punches when it came to Kick-Off Revival's reviews, lambasting everything from the controls, for which there were no instructions, to the sound and graphics. Clearly, an attempt was made to invoke the nostalgia of the Dino Dini titles of the past, but sadly the game failed at every turn. Number 2. Ghostbusters, PlayStation 4, 30%. We've looked at a huge number of terrible games on this channel, but few are so bad that they caused the studio behind them to close down. Alas, such was the fate that awaited Fireforge Games, who filed for bankruptcy just 3 days after the release of 2016's Ghostbusters, though looking at the title's quality, it really isn't all that surprising. In the grand tradition of movie tie-in video games being terrible, Ghostbusters was, according to Metacritic, only half as good as the film on which it was based, scraping an abysmal score of just 30 out of 100 compared to the 60 that critics bestowed upon the movie. Somewhat bafflingly, the game focuses neither on the Ghostbusters of the reboot nor on the original gang from the 1984 movie, and instead opts to introduce a bunch of new faces. This could have perhaps been forgiven if the characters themselves were interesting, but most players found them to be fairly bland. The boredom didn't stop at the protagonists though, as the game's levels were repetitive and far too large, meaning that players spent more time wandering around than they did busting ghosts. The game did include Ray Parker Jr.'s original Ghostbusters soundtrack, but even that wasn't enough to make bustin' feel good. Number 1. Soda Drinker Pro, Xbox One, 29.44%. We've come across some strange games in our time, but few are quite as nuts as Soda Drinker Pro, a video game that allegedly simulated the act of drinking soda. Now, forgive me if I'm in any way missing the point here, but surely simulation games are there to give the players the experience of something that they wouldn't usually do in their everyday lives? Maybe I'm just getting too old to understand these things. Shockingly, critics didn't find too much to love. Soda Drinker Pro was made up of a staggering 100 plus levels, and the goal in each was simply to drink your soda. There was no challenge, difficulty, story, or requirement for any sort of skill on the part of the player, and we can only assume it was created as YouTube fodder. Bizarrely, Soda Drinker Pro did contain a secret subgame called Vivian Clark, which was made up of a series of minigames a la WarioWare. This too was completely bonkers, though some critics did at least give it a little praise for breaking up the otherwise monotonous experience. It seems unlikely that the developer SnowRunner Games intended for Soda Drinker Pro to be an award-winning title, but it was still totally naff nonetheless.